Maya stood frozen in front of the gleaming display case of the jewelry store, her heart racing as she tried to process what was happening. She had been admiring the exquisite diamond necklaces earlier, imagining how beautiful they would look around her neck for a special occasion, but now everything felt like a nightmare. The accusations flew at her like daggers, sharp and unexpected. She took it. The words of the store manager cut through the air, venomous and pointed. I saw her, she was the only one near the display, and now it's missing. Maya's blood ran cold as a wave of disbelief washed over her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. This couldn't be happening. She had been nothing but respectful during her visits to this store, always a polite customer who loved to browse the fine jewelry, but never buying anything due to the high prices. Yet now, she stood accused of theft. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, but it felt impossible. The pearl necklace, which had been placed so elegantly on display just hours before, was now gone. It wasn't even the most expensive piece in the store, but it had caught her attention. She had only leaned over to take a closer look at it, imagining how it would feel to wear such beauty around her neck. And yet, in that brief moment of awe, the necklace was gone, and she was the one left to bear the brunt of suspicion. Maya, please come with us, a uniformed officer said, his voice calm but firm, as he motioned for her to follow him toward the back office. The words stung like a slap, and her feet felt heavy as if she was walking through mud. How had things escalated this quickly? She had been looking at a necklace just moments before, but now she was being led through the store, away from the place she had so often visited, the place that had never felt like this. She felt like she was suffocating under the weight of judgment. Mom, please, she whispered to herself, her heart aching as the reality began to settle in. Please, I didn't do anything. She tried to control her breathing, but her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Her mother was a judge, a respected figure in the community, a woman of strength and authority. Maya had always admired her, had always tried to live up to her mother's expectations of grace, responsibility, and dignity. But now, none of that seemed to matter. The reputation that her mother had so carefully built seemed fragile in this moment. Maya tried to collect her thoughts, but all she could hear were the murmurs from the other shoppers, the whispers of disbelief. The judge's daughter, one woman whispered, she would never. But the doubt in their voices made her feel like she was already condemned. As they moved into the back office, Maya felt as if the walls were closing in on her. The bright fluorescent lights above her head felt too harsh, like they were spotlighting her guilt, even though she knew deep down that she hadn't stolen anything. She had not touched the necklace in any way that would make anyone think she had taken it. She was innocent, yet there she was, trapped in a web of lies that she couldn't escape. She glanced down at her phone, hoping for some kind of reassurance, a message from her mother, or a call telling her that everything would be okay. But when she saw the missed call from her mom, her chest tightened, and her fingers trembled as she dialed her number. Maya, what's going on? Her mother's voice was calm but carried a hint of concern that made Maya's throat tighten. I didn't do it, Mom, Maya stammered, feeling tears start to well up. Please, you have to believe me. I didn't take anything. Her mother's silence felt like an eternity, and Maya could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling in the background. I'll be there soon. Don't say anything until I get there, okay? Maya wanted to scream, to beg her mother to hurry, but she knew she had to be patient. But how could she be patient when everything she had worked so hard for was slipping through her fingers? Her heart felt heavy in her chest as she tried to stay composed, but the fear that gripped her made it almost impossible to think clearly. She couldn't stop the tears that now slid down her cheeks. The guilt, the confusion, the humiliation, all of it rushed in at once. She hadn't stolen anything, and yet, here she was, in a situation she couldn't escape. As much as her mother loved her, and as powerful and respected as she was, Maya knew that this accusation would haunt her. People would whisper. People would doubt. People would forget the woman who had always been proud of her and start seeing the woman in front of them as the criminal they thought she was. Minutes passed, maybe hours. But time felt distorted as she sat there, alone in that sterile, cold office. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, and each second stretched on like an eternity. The reality of the situation was suffocating. Maya wanted to shout, to scream that she didn't belong here. She wanted to run away from the shame that was being thrust upon her. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that the truth would set her free, the world around her was starting to close in. And just as she was about to lose all hope, the door creaked open, and Maya looked up to see a familiar face, her mother's. But the expression on her face was different this time. The warmth that usually radiated from her mother's eyes seemed absent. There was only a quiet, almost cautious look in her gaze as she stepped inside. Maya wanted to run into her arms, to feel the comfort of her mother's embrace. But as her mother walked in, she could see the hesitation in her eyes. It was a hesitation Maya hadn't seen before. "Mom, please," Maya whispered, her voice breaking. "Tell them I didn't do it." Her mother stood there for a moment, looking at her with a mixture of concern and confusion, and then she finally spoke. "I know you didn't, Maya," her mother said softly. "But we need to get this sorted out. You need to stay calm and let me handle this." Maya wanted to shout, to beg her mother for more than just words. She needed her to take action, to fight for her, to make this nightmare go away. But her mother only offered a strained smile, and Maya felt her heart shatter once again. Her mother's presence, which had once been her source of strength, now only reminded her of the distance between them, the gap created by a world that seemed to want to see her fall. And so, Maya sat there, still gripped by the weight of suspicion, trying to convince herself that her mother would fix this, that everything would be okay. But deep inside, a nagging feeling told her that things would never be the same. Maya sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the cold tiles of the back office. The fluorescent lights above her flickered intermittently, adding to the oppressive, sterile feeling that surrounded her. Her mother had arrived, yes, but it felt as if she were still miles away. The room seemed to close in on Maya with every passing second. Her heart raced in her chest, and the fear that had first settled and now threatened to consume her entirely. The man's accusation had been so sudden, so harsh. The weight of it pressed down on her, suffocating her with every breath she took. She could still hear his voice in her head. She took it. "I saw her." Maya squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of those words, but they kept reverberating in her mind. She hadn't taken anything. She hadn't touched that necklace, hadn't stolen a thing. Yet, here she was, in this suffocating room, accused of the one thing she could never bring herself to do. Her mother had stepped in with all the authority that came with being a judge, speaking to the officers and store management with calm precision, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Maya had seen her mother in these situations countless times before, resolute, unwavering, a woman who commanded respect. But now, as she stood there in the corner of the room, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that her mother wasn't fighting for her. She wasn't standing beside her as the mother she knew, the one who had always believed in her. Instead, she felt like just another case, another issue to resolve, and that realization shattered something deep inside Maya's chest. Maya's mind raced, the panic threatening to take over again. She had to remind herself to stay calm, to not let the fear show. But it was so hard, so impossible to keep up the facade. She was suffocating in her own skin, drowning in this situation that had spun out of control so quickly. She had been in this store countless times before, always a quiet presence, never causing trouble. She had walked in today, expecting nothing more than to admire the beautiful pieces on display. How had everything changed so quickly, How had she become the center of such a twisted story? Her mother finally approached her, and Maya looked up, hoping for some sign of reassurance. But all she saw was the same calm, calculating look her mother always wore when addressing a situation in the courtroom. Maya felt a pang of hurt deep in her chest. Her mother was so composed, so in control. But Maya needed more than that right now. She needed someone who would see her, someone who would understand the desperation in her eyes, the terror gnawing at her insides. "Maya," her mother said, her voice low, careful. "Listen to me. You need to stay calm. We're going to figure this out, okay?" Maya could hardly bear it. The words were meant to be comforting, but they only reminded her of how alone she truly was. She nodded numbly, trying to push back the tears that burned in her eyes. She could feel the weight of her mother's gaze, but it didn't make her feel any safer. The image of her mother, the pillar of strength, was slipping away, replaced by the cold reality that even someone with her power couldn't protect Maya from this. "I didn't steal it, Mom. I didn't take anything," Maya whispered, her voice shaky. "You have to believe me. Please." Her mother's gaze softened, but it didn't ease Maya's pain. Her mother nodded, but there was an undertone of something else in her eyes, something Maya couldn't quite place. It was as if her mother were trying to convince herself of something, as if she weren't sure if she could still trust her own daughter's word. It was an unspoken doubt, one that Maya could feel gnawing at her from the inside. "I believe you," her mother said, but Maya could hear the hesitation in her voice. "But right now, we have to let the process take its course." The words felt like a slap. Let the process take its course. That was all Maya was, a case. A problem to be solved. Nothing more. The mother who had always been her protector, the woman who had shown her how to be strong and how to fight for what was right, was now reduced to a stranger who simply trusted that things would work themselves out. Maya felt a tear slip down her cheek. She wiped it away hastily, angry at herself for showing weakness. But the pain was too much to hold back anymore. The hurt, the confusion, the fear, it all came rushing back in waves. She was drowning, and no one could throw her a lifeline. Outside the office, she could hear voices rising, the buzz of whispered conversations. Some were sympathetic, others were skeptical. The judge's daughter, involved in a theft? How could that be? The voices blurred together, but the doubt was palpable. Maya wanted to run, to escape from this nightmare. She had always prided herself on her honesty, her integrity. How could this be happening to her? "Mom, please," Maya said, her voice cracking with desperation. "I didn't do it. I swear. You know me. You know I would never." Her mother's face remained composed, but her eyes betrayed her. She looked torn, as though she didn't know how to protect her daughter from the weight of the situation. Maya could see the conflict swirling inside her. Her mother was a judge, she had spent her life upholding justice, but in this moment, Maya wasn't sure she could trust the woman who had always been her rock. The silence between them stretched out, thick and suffocating. Finally, Maya's mother spoke, her voice heavy with the knowledge that this was no longer just a simple misunderstanding. "I know you didn't steal it, Maya," she said softly, her words barely above a whisper. "But we need to keep the facts clear. The store has a lot of evidence that says otherwise. I'm going to do everything I can to help you, but you need to trust me. We have to let them finish the investigation." Maya shook her head, the tears now flowing freely. "This isn't right, Mom. They're accusing me of something I didn't do. Don't you see? You have to do something now." Her mother's face remained stoic, but the crack in her expression spoke volumes. She didn't have the power to change what was happening to her daughter. No amount of her mother's influence or position could stop the storm from tearing through their lives. The irony was crushing. Maya had always believed that the law was there to protect the innocent, but in that moment, it felt like the law was the very thing that might destroy her. As the officers continued their questioning outside, Maya felt a coldness settle in her chest. She was no longer the daughter of a judge, no longer someone who could simply walk into a room and command respect. She was just a girl accused of something that would follow her for the rest of her life. The thought of living with this stain, of facing the world with a name that had been soiled by a lie, felt unbearable. And yet, the worst part of it all was the feeling that no one, not even her mother, could see her anymore. She was a problem to be fixed, not a daughter to be loved and supported. The mother who had always been her shield, her protector, was now just another figure in the courtroom, defending her daughter not with love but with the coldness of a professional. It was a betrayal Maya hadn't expected, and it stung more deeply than anything else. Maya's mind raced, the weight of her mother's words settling heavily in her chest. "We have to let them finish the investigation," her mother had said, but to Maya, it sounded like a death sentence. Every part of her rebelled against the idea of sitting back and waiting for the truth to be revealed, knowing that the longer she was trapped in this nightmare, the harder it would be to escape. The sting of her mother's distance, her lack of fierce protection, burned deeper than the accusations themselves. She could feel the suffocating silence between them growing thicker by the second. She wanted to scream, to demand that her mother see her, not as a problem to be solved but as her daughter, her flesh and blood. But every word she tried to form in her mouth felt useless, like a plea to an unfeeling world. Her mother's cool, calculated composure made her feel even more isolated. Maya wasn't a daughter to be defended. She was just another case for her mother to handle, another problem to fix. Maya's throat tightened as she looked up at her mother, her heart swelling with a mixture of hurt and desperation. "How can you just stand there, Mom? Don't you care about me anymore? This isn't just some case for you to handle. It's my life." Her mother's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of emotion crossing her face before it was quickly masked. She took a slow breath and placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, her fingers cold and distant. "I care about you more than you'll ever understand, Maya," her mother said quietly, her voice steady but lacking warmth. "But right now, I need to make sure the facts are clear. If you didn't do this, the truth will come out. But we have to follow the process." The words fell flat, unable to ease the gnawing fear and frustration that clawed at Maya's insides. She was suffocating in the very room that should have been her sanctuary. Her mother, the one person she had always turned to in moments of crisis, was now just a figure of authority, dishing out logic while Maya was drowning in her own panic. The sting of betrayal was sharp, and Maya couldn't stop the tears that blurred her vision. "Please, Mom," Maya whispered through the sobs that broke free. "I'm scared. I didn't do anything. They're lying about me." Her mother's hand squeezed her shoulder, but it was more out of habit than comfort. Maya could feel the distance between them, like an unbridgeable chasm that no words could cross. The suffocating silence that followed was deafening. Maya wanted to scream, to make her mother see the truth, to make her mother fight for her. But it was as if the world had already decided Maya's fate. The whispers outside the office, the murmurs of disbelief and judgment, echoed in her ears. Her name had already been dragged through the mud, and no amount of pleading would wash away the stain. "Don't cry," her mother said, her voice sharp now, as if she were trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping through her fingers. "You need to stay strong, Maya. Don't let them see you break. Stay strong." Maya repeated the words in her mind, but it felt like an impossible task. How could she stay strong when everything she had ever believed in was crumbling around her? She wasn't just being accused of theft, she was being accused of something far worse. She was being accused of betraying everything she stood for, of breaking the trust of her community, of her family. The very foundation of who she was had been shaken, and in the face of it, She didn't know how to hold herself together. Her mother turned to speak with the officers again, her voice steady and authoritative, but Maya didn't hear the words. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears, a rhythm of fear and pain that drowned out everything else. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, minutes, hours, maybe more. But it felt like an eternity, a prison of her own making. Finally, the door opened, and a man Maya didn't recognize stepped into the room. He was dressed in a suit, his expression stern, his gaze calculating. His presence was like a weight pressing down on her, reminding her of the seriousness of the situation. The officers had stepped aside for him, allowing him to take charge. "Maya, I'm Detective Harris," the man said, his voice curt. "We need to go over the details of what happened. We'll get to the truth, but we need your cooperation." Maya looked at him, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. "I didn't do it," she repeated, her voice trembling. "You have to believe me. I didn't take anything." Detective Harris studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "The store has security footage that shows you near the display case," he said, his voice clinical. "And witnesses saw you linger longer than other customers. We need to go over everything, Maya. Every detail counts." Her heart sank as his words hit her like a cold slap. Security footage. The very thing she had hoped wouldn't exist, the very thing that might condemn her, was now the center of the investigation. Maya had been so focused on the necklace, so lost in her own thoughts, that she hadn't paid attention to anyone else around her. The footage, however, didn't capture her innocence, it captured her lingering near the display, caught in a moment of vulnerability. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. She wanted to argue, to shout that she hadn't taken the necklace, that it was all a mistake. But the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of the evidence they had against her. Her mother had told her to stay calm, to let the process unfold, but Maya felt as if the walls were closing in on her. "I didn't take it," Maya whispered again, but her voice was barely audible, drowned by the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. Detective Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he flipped open his notebook and began scribbling something down, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The sound of it, the scratch of ink on paper, filled the room, and Maya felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It was as if the world had already written her story, had already decided what kind of person she was, and she was powerless to change it. Her mother stood by, silent, watching it all unfold. Maya couldn't read her expression, but the distance in her eyes made Maya feel as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, with nothing but the abyss below. "This isn't you, Maya," her mother said quietly, her voice strained. "But the evidence is there. We need to handle this carefully. You need to trust me. Trust her." Trust her? Maya wanted to scream, but all she could do was nod, her emotions a whirlwind of hurt and anger. This wasn't the mother she had known, the woman who had always been a symbol of strength and protection. The woman who had always told her to fight for what was right. Now, Maya was left to fight alone, facing a battle she couldn't win without the one person who had always been her ally. And as the detective continued his questioning, Maya realized just how much she had lost in this moment. The truth seemed further away than ever before. The accusations, the evidence, the whispers, they were all part of a story that wasn't hers. And yet, somehow, the world was determined to make it her reality. The hours seemed to stretch into infinity as Detective Harris continued to ask question after question. Maya's mind felt like a haze, her thoughts spinning in circles, trying to hold on to the one truth she knew: she hadn't done it. But no matter how many times she repeated it, no one seemed to believe her. Not the officers. Not the store manager. And certainly not the customers who had already passed judgment on her. The walls of the room felt smaller with each passing moment, closing in around her, suffocating her. Her mother stood off to the side, her arms folded across her chest, watching with a quiet intensity that made Maya feel even more isolated. She had been silent for the past few minutes, her gaze distant, her expression unreadable. Maya couldn't help but feel betrayed. She had always trusted her mother to fight for her, to see the truth, no matter how complicated or painful. But now, it seemed as if her mother was merely a spectator, watching her daughter drown in a sea of lies, offering no lifeline. Maya had always known her mother to be strong, unyielding, unbending in the face of adversity. But today, she saw her differently. She saw the woman who had once been her protector, now as an outsider, unwilling or unable to fully step into the role she had always played. The distance between them felt like a canyon that Maya couldn't cross. And the worst part was, she didn't know if she even wanted to anymore. "Mom," Maya whispered, her voice cracking. "Why aren't you fighting for me? Why aren't you doing anything?" Her mother flinched slightly, but didn't move. Her eyes flickered over to Maya, then quickly turned away, as if she couldn't bear the weight of the question. Maya's heart pounded painfully in her chest. She had always been her mother's world. Always. And now, it felt like she was nothing more than a problem to be solved. Her mother had always told her to stand up for herself, to never let anyone push her down. But now, when Maya needed her the most, her mother was standing silent, watching her get pushed under. "Maya," her mother said, her voice tight, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something to hold onto. "You know how this works. We have to follow the process. The evidence, it's not in our favor right now. You need to let them do their job." But Maya couldn't listen to her mother anymore. She couldn't stand to hear those words. The weight of the situation, the suffocating air in the room, the look in her mother's eyes, it all crushed her spirit. She wanted to scream, to shout, to make her mother see her again, but her words were stuck in her throat, choked by the sharpness of her pain. "I didn't do it," she repeated, her voice hoarse. "You know me. I wouldn't do that." Her mother's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, but the moment passed quickly, leaving Maya feeling more alone than ever. She was a girl in the middle of a storm, caught between her truth and the lies that others had already chosen to believe. The world had already made its decision about her. Her own mother, the woman who should have been her anchor, was standing on the sidelines, watching her drown. "Why are you doing this?" Maya's voice was barely audible now, a whisper of desperation. "Why are you letting them do this to me?" Her mother opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. For a long, agonizing moment, she simply stared at Maya, her eyes filled with something Maya couldn't place, regret, maybe, or guilt, or something even worse. Maya couldn't take it. She couldn't stand the silence, the distance, the coldness. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Detective Harris entered again, his face set in the same hard expression as before. "We've got everything we need," he said curtly, his voice clipped. "We'll be processing the case, and you'll be notified of the next steps. I suggest you stay here until further notice." Maya's heart sank. This was it. This was her life now. The words felt like a death sentence. She was going to be remembered as the girl who was accused of theft. No amount of pleading or truth could change that now. She stood up abruptly, her legs trembling beneath her. "I didn't do it," she repeated for what felt like the 100th time, but the words felt hollow. The fear, the humiliation, the betrayal, they were too much. Her body felt like it was collapsing under the weight of the world. "Maya, sit down," her mother said, her voice sharp now, a hint of authority creeping back in. But Maya couldn't listen. She couldn't stand still in this place anymore, couldn't be surrounded by the cold indifference of people who didn't know her, didn't care to know her. She needed to get out. Without another word, Maya turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back, even though she could feel her mother's eyes following her every step. She couldn't face her anymore. Not like this. Not when everything had been twisted, when the woman she had always trusted was nothing more than a shadow, standing on the sidelines, watching her fall. As she stepped out of the office, she was met with a chorus of whispers. The store's employees, the customers who had witnessed everything, they all stared at her with varying degrees of judgment. There she is, the thief. The daughter of a judge, and yet, a criminal. The thought stung like a slap, and Maya felt the tears welling up in her eyes again. But she blinked them away, forcing herself to walk with as much dignity as she could muster, even though she felt like her world was crumbling around her. She stepped into the harsh light of the store's entrance, the cold air outside biting at her skin. The city was still bustling, still unaware of the storm that had just torn through her life. She was nothing more than a shadow in this world, a girl falsely accused, and yet no one cared enough to listen to her side. Her mother's words echoed in her head, "You need to let them do their job." But Maya didn't know how to let them do their job when every step of the process was a step toward her own destruction. Every minute that passed, every word that was spoken, pushed her further into a corner, until she could barely breathe. And yet, as she stood there on the edge of the sidewalk, her heart heavy with the weight of the lies that had been thrust upon her, Maya felt a flicker of something inside her, a spark, a flame that refused to be extinguished. She didn't know how she would fight this. She didn't know how she would survive the crushing weight of the accusations, the betrayal of her mother, the judgment of the world. But she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let them define her. No matter what happened, no matter how dark the days ahead seemed, she would fight for her truth. She would fight to reclaim her name, her dignity, her life. Because she knew who she was. She knew what she stood for. And no matter how far they tried to push her down, she wouldn't break. Maya's legs trembled as she walked away from the store, each step heavy with the weight of the accusations that clung to her like a second skin. The cold air outside did little to numb the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She was caught between the burning need to defend herself and the crushing feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. Every person who passed by seemed to look at her with judgment in their eyes, as if they could already see the thief she was being made out to be. The humiliation was unbearable. The whispers had already spread, she knew. Word would get around, and soon everyone in the neighborhood would believe the lie. The daughter of a judge, the one person who was supposed to uphold the law, now reduced to a criminal in the eyes of the world. The thought of it made her stomach turn. How could she face anyone again? How could she look her mother in the eye and know that she had not fought for her? Her mind raced back to that moment in the office, the way her mother had turned away, as if Maya were no longer her daughter but a case to be managed. It was as if the woman who had always been her pillar, her protector, had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind someone who didn't know how to fight for her own child. The words, "I care about you," rang hollow now. They had been said 100 times, but now they felt like a distant memory. What was the use of those words when they were never followed by action? Her mother's silence in that room, the way she had distanced herself from Maya's pain, haunted her. Was this how it was going to be from now on? Was she just another case for her mother to solve, another file to be tucked away and forgotten? Maya didn't know how much more of this she could bear. As she walked, she didn't notice where her feet were taking her, only that she was trying to escape, to outrun the suffocating weight of the situation. She needed to be alone, away from the prying eyes, away from the whispers, away from the guilt that had been heaped on her unjustly. Maya found herself at the edge of the city, standing in front of a small park, the trees bare and the ground covered in frost. The wind howled around her, but she didn't feel the cold. She was numb to everything except the thumping of her own heart in her chest, the relentless pounding of a pain so deep she didn't know how to stop it. She had no one left. No one to turn to. The reality of her isolation hit her harder than the chill in the air. Her mother, her once steadfast ally, had turned away, leaving her in the hands of a system that cared more about appearances than justice. Maya felt her body shake with a new wave of frustration. It wasn't fair. None of it was. How could they all so easily assume she was guilty? How could they believe the lies without a second thought? Tears burned in her eyes as she stood there, the world around her spinning out of control. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was supposed to be the one who could lean on her mother, the one who could be protected by the woman who had always fought for what was right. But now, Maya was left to fend for herself, abandoned by the one person who should have been her shield. She dropped to her knees on the cold ground, unable to hold back the sobs that racked her body. The tears fell freely now, each one a release of the pain she had been holding in for so long. She had never felt so small, so powerless. She was nothing but a girl who had been wronged by the world, by the people she trusted, by the one person who should have been her strength. And yet, no one cared. No one was there to catch her as she fell. But as the tears soaked her cheeks, something stirred deep inside her, a quiet, fragile voice that whispered through the noise of her pain. You are not this lie. You are not what they say you are. It wasn't loud, wasn't a triumphant declaration. It was a quiet promise, a reminder of who she truly was. Maya wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her chest heaving as she sucked in a shaky breath. The cold ground beneath her felt like a grounding force, pulling her back to herself, reminding her that she was still here, still breathing. The fight wasn't over yet. No matter how badly they tried to break her, no matter how alone she felt, she would not let them steal her truth. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady but determined. There was no way she was going to let them win. She wouldn't allow herself to be consumed by the weight of their lies, by the isolation they had forced on her. She wouldn't give in to the despair that threatened to pull her under. She had to fight. And as the wind howled around her, Maya realized that it wasn't just the world that was against her, it was the very person who had brought her into this world, the one who had always taught her to stand up for what was right. Her mother had betrayed her, yes. But that didn't mean Maya had to abandon herself. She could still fight for the truth, for her dignity, for her future. Her mother may not have been there for her when it mattered, but Maya didn't need her to be. She had the strength to face this on her own. She had always been strong. And now, more than ever, she had to prove that to herself. With a deep breath, she began to walk back toward the city, toward the confrontation that awaited her. She didn't know how this would all play out, but one thing was clear, she wasn't going to be silenced. She wasn't going to let them destroy her. Her journey was far from over. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Maya felt a spark of hope. She would face the world head-on, and no matter how difficult it became, no matter how much she had to endure, she would not be broken. And when the truth came to light, when the lies were exposed for what they were, she would rise from this. Maya was determined to reclaim her life, her name, her dignity. The storm might rage around her, but she would stand firm, unyielding. She was more than the accusations. She was Maya. And nothing, no one, would take that away from her. Maya stood in front of the courthouse, the wind biting at her skin, her heart racing as she clutched the crumpled envelope in her hand. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and yet, now that it was finally here, she felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling away. The entire city had watched her fall, and now they would witness the moment when her truth was laid bare. The courtroom doors were heavy, each one a reminder of everything she had been through, the betrayal, the humiliation, the crushing weight of the lies. As she stepped inside, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. She could hear them, the whispers, the accusations that had followed her every step since the day she was accused. But today, she wouldn't let them reach her. She had fought for this moment, for her redemption, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it away. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. Maya took her place at the front, her eyes meeting the eyes of the jury, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. She was ready to face them all, ready to show them that they had been wrong. She had never stolen anything from that store, and now, she was going to prove it. But then, as the trial unfolded, something unexpected happened. A figure walked into the courtroom, a person Maya never thought she would see again. Her mother. Her mother stood there, her face pale, her eyes avoiding Maya's gaze. She had always been the one person Maya could rely on, the one person who had taught her right from wrong. But that had changed the moment she had stood by and let Maya suffer. Now, Maya saw her, not as the woman who had raised her, but as the woman who had allowed her to drown in silence. Maya's breath caught in her throat. The courtroom seemed to spin around her. What was her mother doing here? Her mother's footsteps were steady as she walked to the witness stand. Maya watched in disbelief as she took her seat, the weight of the moment sinking in. She couldn't speak. The pain, the betrayal, all of it rushed back. How could her mother be here now, after all that had happened? "Your Honor," her mother began, her voice shaky but firm. "I have something to say." The room held its breath as her mother's words sliced through the air. "I have reason to believe that my daughter is innocent. The evidence presented against her was fabricated. The necklace that was allegedly stolen? It was planted in her bag." Maya's eyes widened in shock, her pulse quickening as the words began to sink in. Her mother had known all along. She had been the one to discover the truth, the one to finally find the missing pieces that would exonerate Maya. But why hadn't she said anything before? Why hadn't she stood by her when it mattered most? "I know I failed her," her mother continued, her voice faltering. "I stood by and allowed my own pain, my own fears, to cloud my judgment. I didn't protect her when she needed me the most. But I can't let her be punished for something she didn't do." Maya's heart pounded in her chest as the room erupted into chaos. Her mother had betrayed her, yes, but now she was speaking the truth. Maya's mother had come through in the end, though far too late, and in doing so, she had given Maya something that no one else could, the chance to finally clear her name. The courtroom was a whirlwind of emotions. The lawyers scrambled to process the new evidence, but Maya barely heard them. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart, the rush of blood in her ears, as the realization of what this meant slowly washed over her. Her mother wasn't perfect. She had failed Maya, yes, and her betrayal would never be forgotten. But in that moment, Maya understood something profound. No one is immune to failure. Not even the people we put on pedestals. Not even the ones we trust with our very lives. We all have our flaws, our moments of weakness. And sometimes, the greatest lessons come not from the victories, but from the brokenness we endure. The judge paused, the gavel hanging in the air as they deliberated the new revelation. Maya felt herself holding her breath. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. But then, as the judge called the court back to order, something unexpected happened. The store manager, the one who had accused her, stood up from his seat. "I need to confess something," he said, his voice trembling with guilt. "I was the one who planted the necklace in her bag. I did it to cover up my own mistake. I thought I could get away with it, but I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Maya didn't steal anything. I did it." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the weight of the revelation hit her. The manager had framed her. He had orchestrated everything. And now, he was confessing. Maya was exonerated. Her name would be cleared. But as the judge banged the gavel and the crowd erupted in disbelief, Maya's mind wasn't on the victory. It wasn't on the vindication that had come so suddenly, so shockingly. No, her thoughts were on her mother. The woman who had failed her but had also come through in the end. The woman who had let her down but had also shown her that redemption was still possible. Maya's gaze locked onto her mother's. And for the first time, despite all the pain, despite the betrayal, Maya felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had been broken, torn apart by the world, by the people she trusted. But now, she stood whole once more. Not because of her mother's late intervention, but because she had found the strength to rise above it all. She had fought for her truth. She had fought for herself. And as the courtroom slowly emptied, as people buzzed about the shocking confession, Maya realized something even more important. True strength comes not from perfection, but from the ability to forgive and move forward. Her mother had faltered, and so had Maya. But in the end, both of them had learned that sometimes, the hardest lessons are the ones that lead to the most profound transformations. As Maya walked out of the courthouse, her head held high, she didn't feel bitter. She didn't feel angry. She didn't even feel triumphant. What she felt was something far greater than all of those combined: peace. She had learned to forgive, not because the world had forgiven her, but because she had forgiven herself. And with that, Maya knew she was free.